Mydei, the Guardian of Amphoreus, is a fan-favorite character for a variety of, reasons. I'm sure Phanon can tell you even more about what those are.
That immortal body soaks up damage like a sponge. Trust me, I've tested it myself.
When I posted a poll asking my subscribers if they prefer me to focus my research around Atribios or Mydei this patch, the results were literally dead even for a shocking amount of time, until Mydei narrowly won out with a whopping 52%. So, here we are. I've spent the last month or so relentlessly researching his inspirations to make the best Mydei video possible. Seriously, I've read countless books, epics, and academic papers tracing history from the Roman Empire all the way back to the dawn of human civilization, all to better understand Mydei and Hoyo's intentions with his design and story. So, needless to say, I've learned a lot, and I cannot wait to dive in. A huge thanks to my friend Stella, whose pre-existing historical knowledge helped expedite the research process. Without her, this video would have taken even longer to finish. Now, don't worry, the entire history of Eurasia is a bit much for a single video, so I'm only going to be discussing things that are relevant to Mydei and providing extra resources in the description for the truly curious independent researchers. But Lullity, you ask, how much research could you need? Isn't Mydei just based on Spartan Greek culture? No, my job would have been so easy if that was the case. The thing about culture is that it's always been something fluid, influenced by trade, migration, war, and political superpowers. Ancient Greece was no exception. Its history is deeply intertwined with the powerful civilizations of the Mediterranean and Mesopotamia, the Canaanite Phoenicians, Hittites, Persians, Assyrians, Akkadians, Sumerians, and Egyptians. Mydei specifically as a character seems to be rooted especially in the Mesopotamian mythology itself and in Greek figures whose stories heavily involved their eastern neighbours, such as Alexander the Great, who conquered Mesopotamia and Egypt, only stopping when his soldiers refused to march further into India. The writers at Hoyoverse are extremely knowledgeable about world history, mythology, and religion, and characters like Mydei really showcase that expertise, even if only a fraction of their audience would ever fully appreciate the extent of it. Before we jump in, a quick content warning. This video covers some very heavy, mature, and sensitive topics, including blood drinking and cannibalism, ritualistic sacrifice of humans, both adult and child, ritualistic animal sacrifice, sex worship and sacred prostitution, slavery, violence, and war. I'll also be discussing world history in relation to religion and religious practices that might be perceived as insensitive or even blasphemous. If any of this is something you can't tolerate, you might have to sit this one out. I'll try to be as mindful as possible, but these themes are so intertwined with Mydei's inspirations that I can't really avoid talking about it. I mean, he literally drinks pomegranate juice as a substitute for blood and was sacrificed to God as a baby. I really, seriously can't avoid it. If you're still here and ready to go, let's not delay this already monstrously long video any further. Let's start with Chapter 1, Gilgamesh. Are you familiar with the ancient Sumerians? Or their successors, the Akkadians? Or even, perhaps, the Babylonians? They were the first known civilization to build cities and pioneered countless innovations: writing, astronomy, the 12 zodiacs, Pythagorean theorem, geometry, engraved gem seals, wheeled wagons, the 60 base system we still use for time and circles, 7-day weeks with a day of rest, the lyre and music theory, the global flood myth, and sacred numbers like 7 and 3. They even wrote the first political comedy, the first epic, the first legal code, and developed the phalanx formation, defense of city walls, and so much more. Considering they lived up to 6,000 years ago, when most of the world, except for Egypt, was still in small tribes and villages, their impact on Western civilization is staggering, and yet barely anyone knows their name. Unless you're familiar with the Fate series. That might seem random, but you may have heard that Honkai Star Rail has an upcoming collaboration with the Fate series, teased a little while ago. Hoyoverse has made subtle nods to Fate before, and Mydei is their latest one. If you're unfamiliar with Fate, its whole theme is turning real or mythological historical figures into anime characters, and throwing them into more or less time travel shenanigans. Honestly, I'm not that deep into it myself. My only exposure was watching Fate's Day Night as a teenager, where I vaguely remember Artoria, aka Saber, the female King Arthur who was everyone's favourite wallpaper. Oh, and of course the people die when they are killed meme, which I still quote to this day. Anyway, Hoyo are both history nerds and otaku, so naturally they love Fate. And this matters because Mydei's visual design is heavily inspired by Fate's depiction of Gilgamesh, the legendary Sumerian god king from the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest known epic in human history. But before diving into Gilgamesh himself, we need some context on Sumerian culture and mythology, especially since it laid the foundation for later religions like Hellenism and Abrahamism. The ancient Sumerian religion was polytheistic, and their gods existed predominantly to embody and explain natural phenomena such as the sun, the moon, the 5 visible planets, the constellations, the sea, seasons, death, disease, lightning, etc., etc., etc. You might already recognize one of their deities if you know Kevin from Honkai Impact 3rd. His divine key weapon, Judgment of Shamash, is named after the Sumerian sun god, whom Gilgamesh also prays to as his patron deity. This weapon's immense fiery power has a high chance of destroying its user. Keep that in mind, as we'll later discuss Nanook and self-sacrifice. The Sumerians believed they were created by the gods, the Anunnaki, as slaves to provide food, shelter, and offerings. According to their myth, the gods once lived on Earth but hated taking care of themselves, so they mixed clay with the blood of a sacrificed god to create humans. That divine blood was what made humans superior to animals. However, this dynamic also made their gods antagonistic. If angered, they would bring disaster. An example of this is in their flood myth. The god Enlil, the head of the pantheon that controlled the wind and storms, was upset with the growing population of humans causing too much noise, so he planned a flood to destroy all of them. But Enki, the god of water and knowledge who created humans from clay with his wife, saw the flaw in this plan. After all, the gods needed slaves, so secretly he went to the king, Utnapishtim, instructing him to build a boat big enough to fit his family, one of each kind of craftsman and a pair of each animal, so they could survive the flood. During the flood, the king used 3 kinds of birds, including the dove and the raven, to scout for land 3 times. Sound familiar? This story predates both Noah's Ark and Deucalion's flood by at least a millennium, yet it shares core elements with both: the wrathful storm god, the chosen survivor, and divine intervention from the deity who created mankind from clay. As we go through this video, you'll see how much of modern religion is essentially a 6,000-year-old game of telephone, with each branch evolving in wildly different directions, yet retaining echoes of the same origins. Perhaps the most important deity to our story is Ishtar, the goddess of lust and war, and the patron goddess of Uruk. Represented by Venus, the 8-point star, the dove, the rosette, and the mighty lion, she was one of the most worshipped Sumerian gods, often called the Queen of Heaven. If you know anything about Aphrodite, you might already be suspicious, but we'll get to that later. I could probably talk about Ishtar all day, but I'll try my best to keep this swift. Generally speaking, Ishtar is supposed to be in a sacred marriage with the legendary shepherd king Dumuzi, who is worshipped as a god in his own right, and the people loved this marriage. Seriously, I've read ancient smutty fanfics of them involving puns about drinking his milk. Truly, humans have always been the same. Now, all Sumerian kings were considered shepherds of the people, which is also why you see them depicted with shepherd head wraps in art. As the spouse of the king, Ishtar is closely associated with politics and war. This is also why, if you read the Epic of Gilgamesh, there's a scene where Ishtar tries to marry Gilgamesh. To honor this divine union, Sumerian kings would periodically engage in a ritualistic marriage with a priestess, emulating Ishtar and Dumuzi. As she was predominantly a goddess of lust, Sumerian culture had a very open reverence for sex, not only as something that should be done frequently, but also something that is capable of great power, like in the case of Gilgamesh's soulmate Enkidu. He was a man made fresh from clay to be Gilgamesh's equal and capable of stopping his tyrannical behavior. Seriously, Gilgamesh thought it was his right to claim every bride's first time in the marital bed for himself before her husband, but Enkidu was totally wild, living among the animals, and so the locals used a prostitute to seduce him, separate him from the animals, and then lead him into civilization as if she were a goddess. Naturally, there is a lot of overlap between priests and prostitutes within Sumerian culture, so don't make the mistake of applying modern concepts and attitudes to their role. In the story of Inanna and Utu, the Sumerian names for these gods, I've been using their Akkadian versions. Ishtar, who knows nothing of sex, begs her twin brother Shamash to take her to the underworld so she can taste the fruits there and learn its secrets. Once there, she gains knowledge and embraces her role as the goddess of lust. Similarly, in Inanna and the Hulupu tree, Ishtar wants to create a throne for herself, so she plants a special tree she found along the river into her garden in Uruk to grow the wood she needs. Unfortunately, the tree becomes inhabited by a serpent, a Lilith demon, and a lion eagle creature called the Anzu. She recruits Gilgamesh to rid the tree of these creatures, and in his success, she gains her throne and her bed. This brings us to an important historical point. The biblical Exodus story of escaping Egypt as freed slaves is now considered to be a founding myth. Archaeology suggests the Israelites were a branch of the Canaanite people. This matters because the Canaanites, or Phoenicians, were part of the Akkadian Empire and heavily influenced by Akkadian culture. Don't forget, the Akkadians were successors to the Sumerians, and the names Ishtar and Gilgamesh are the Akkadian versions of Inanna and Gilgamesh. This connection is doubly significant because the Phoenicians were a major cultural influence on Greece, especially during their peak as a trading superpower from about 1200 to 800 BC, following the late Bronze Age collapse. This was the same period when the Iliad and the Odyssey were written, texts in the ancient Greek alphabet, which is actually a copy of the Phoenician script itself derived from Egyptian hieroglyphs. Homer is said to have lived in Ionia and spent time in the East and in Egypt, and though we don't know if this is actually true, mostly because we don't even know if Homer was a real person, we can see traces of the Epic of Gilgamesh inside the story of the Iliad, especially in the poetic motifs present in the death of Patroclus and the death of Enkidu, where both heroes rip out their hair and stalk around described as a lioness without her cubs, only to immediately realize their own mortality and begin to fear death. This is a critical plot point for Gilgamesh because it sets him off on a quest for immortality, leading to his discovery of the flood myth and his eventual acceptance of death as he lays himself down in his tomb. I've mentioned Enkidu a few times, but the dynamic that Mydei shares with Phaenon is clearly derived from Gilgamesh and Enkidu, just as Achilles and Patroclus were. Enkidu filled almost every positive role in Gilgamesh's life and kept him in check as his only equal. I cannot emphasize enough that Gilgamesh was a figure that even the gods themselves didn't want to tussle with directly, so they had to make Enkidu to deal with him. Before his creation, Gilgamesh had had prophetic dreams about Enkidu as a shooting star and an axe, both of which are considered puns to refer to male sacred prostitutes. As Gilgamesh recounts the dream to his mother, the goddess Ninsun, he explains how all the city was crowded around it and says, like a babe in arms, they were kissing its feet. Like a wife, I loved it, caressed, and embraced it. I lifted it up and set it down at your feet, and you, O mother, you made it my equal. His wise mother explains, the stars of heaven appeared before you. Like a rock from the sky, one fell down before you. You lifted it up, but it weighed too much for you. You tried to roll it, but you could not dislodge it. You lifted it up, set it down at my feet, and I, Ninsun, I made it your equal. Like a wife, you loved it, caressed, and embraced it. A mighty comrade will come to you and be his friend's savior. Mightiest in the land, strength he possesses. His strength is as mighty as a rock from the sky. Like a wife, you'll love him, caress and embrace him. He will be mighty and often will save you. Once they finally meet, Enkidu confronts Gilgamesh about his tyrannical ways outside the marital chamber, and they battle for a week straight. There was no winner, but when the fighting stops, the text reads, they kissed each other and formed a friendship. For Gilgamesh, a mighty king without equal, the title of friend is the highest honor. Gilgamesh takes Enkidu to see his mother, and she notes that he has no kin or family and was born in the wild, her words bringing Enkidu to tears. There's missing text, but for some reason this results on a mission into the forest. Long story. And while they're away, his mother appeals to Shamash. When they return, she fulfills her promise to make Enkidu Gilgamesh's equal socially. She summons him and officially adopts him, saying, "O mighty Enkidu, you are not sprung from my womb, but henceforth your brood will belong with the votaries of Gilgamesh, the priestesses, the hero jewels, and the women of the temple." She put the symbols around Enkidu's neck. The priestesses took in the foundling, and the divine daughters brought up the foster child. Enkidu, whom I love, I take for my son. Enkidu, in brotherhood, Gilgamesh shall favor him. For Sumerian gods, referring to each other as brother and sister was an expression that is not literal but indicates an equal social status, and this was the intent as Enkidu was adopted as Gilgamesh's brother. As equals, they are socially allowed to be best friends, lovers, and partners in everything. And remember the overlap of priestesses and prostitutes? This is the role Enkidu now fills as part of the women of the temple. Keep in mind, male priests of this nature would also be referred to with female pronouns. I should also mention that Enkidu as a wild man was mentioned to be living among the antelopes, specifically gazelles, and during the bath sprite fade to black with suspicious groaning sounds that definitely doesn't exist, only to allude to certain activities that would not pass censorship. The bath sprite compares a Mydei and Phaenon to a lion and an oryx, also a species of antelope native to the dry grasslands and deserts of the Arabian Peninsula and Africa.
Long before the dawn of Erechrysia, the two beasts started their timeless battle on the plains of Tritos. The lion regarded the oryx as its food, while the oryx perceived the lion as a scornful, oppressive, and challenging barrier that it swore to topple with its antlers. For tens of thousands of years, without respite, the two creatures thus continued their relentless pursuit and rivalry. It fixated on its rival's fleeing form in the chase. It set its sights on the other's neck, nearly within reach. It was stuck in a corner. It had nowhere to escape.
As for the Greco-Roman interpretation of Gilgamesh, there is actually one direct mention of him by a Roman author in De Natura Animalium, a document listing information about assorted animals. For the story of the eagle, the author talks about how the king of Babylon prophesied that his grandson would take the kingdom from him, and in the king's fear of the grandson, he put strict watch on his daughter. Regardless, she became pregnant, and so the gods took the baby and hurled it from the top of the citadel. That prophesied baby was rescued by an eagle, and he grew up to eventually become King Gilgamesh of Babylon, taking the kingdom from his grandfather. While not a direct one-to-one of Mydei, the similarities are likely not a coincidence. One more thing while we're here, I mentioned before how Kevin, and in fact the entire Kazlana family line, are associated with Shamash the sun god in Honkai Impact 3rd. When it comes to Phaenon, his name actually refers to the planet Saturn, and so does the Persian name Kevon. So that's the thing. In Sumerian astrology, because the sun itself is not present in the night sky, when making divinations they actually used Saturn as a stand-in for the sun. Hence, they refer to Saturn as the dark sun. You may not know this, but Sumerian astronomy and astrology was the direct reference for the Greek astronomers. Since Babylon contained so much recorded data about the stars from thousands of years, after Alexander's conquest of the Mesopotamia region, the Greeks took control of this data and used it to advance their own astronomical knowledge. Simultaneously, Phaethon is sometimes used as a synonym for Phaethon, the name of the son of Eos, the dawn goddess, and the mortal Cephalus. This Phaethon is a mortal lover kidnapped by Aphrodite and taken to Syria, where she bears his children as an alternate version of the Adonis story, but I'll talk more of Adonis later. Phaethon is also the same name as the son of Helios, the sun god, known for taking control of the sun chariot, but losing control and setting the earth ablaze, creating the desert in his wake. I don't think I need to explain why these details are relevant to Phaethon, because obviously, but I especially love the poeticness of Phaethon as Saturn, representing the dark sun within the Prophecies divined in the Evernight of Orynyx. Chapter 2: Hunt and Destruction. Alright, time to pivot away from specifically Mydei and Gilgamesh and into Nikidor and Aquila, the paths of hunt and destruction, golden blood and the golden scapegoats, Castrum Kremnos as Sparta, and pomegranates. A seemingly random compilation of topics, but hopefully by the end of this chapter some things will make sense. To begin, let's talk about the rivalry between Nikidor and Aquila. It's referenced several times in Readables and the Divergent Universe. Nikidor was obsessed with relentlessly pursuing Aquila across the skies during the Era Bellica, the same period when Nikidor, Zagreus, and Thanatos arrived at Amphorius. This is also when the Golden Scapegoat puzzle first appeared, but I'll cover that later. According to the history left by Ptolemy and supported by Strife's miracles in the DU, Nikidor was fixated on chasing Aquila around in a relentless hunt. Since Nikidor was mainly battling the Black Tide, and given the suspicious appearance of Aquila's constructs during the Black Tide attack on the Grove, I suspect these goals may have been intertwined. This is why Nikidor and Strife are associated with the path of the hunt in DU rather than the expected path of destruction. As I've explained in previous videos, Lan the Hunt is inspired by the legendary Chinese hunter Hou Yi. Hou Yi is famous for shooting down 9 of the 10 suns when they appeared together and threatened to scorch the world. In this myth, the suns are depicted as raven birds, which is why the sun is sometimes shown with a raven in Chinese art. The suns lived in a giant tree that Hou Yi had to shoot through, paralleling Lan hunting the tree on Yaoshe. However, in Amphorius, Hou Yi Nikidor, like Lan, targets the many suns directly. Both Nikidor and Aquila are, of course, overlaid with other myths here too. Aquila is the easiest to explain. They're basically every kind of potential firebird. Their name Aquila means eagle, and we learn in DU that eagles are also the sun phoenixes. The Greeks thought that phoenixes came from Egypt, but it's not actually clear which group started the phoenix thing first. Herodotus describes it as a large bird with red and gold feathers resembling an eagle. He recounts a tale where the bird brings the embalmed body of its parent to the Temple of the Sun in Heliopolis. This may refer to the Egyptian deity Bennu associated with the sun and periodic rebirth, but that's not confirmed. Additionally, the sun is symbolized as an eye in Egyptian themes, connecting to Ra's hawk-headed sun disk, the Eye of Ra. Zeus also had an eagle, and his name comes from the Proto-Indo-European Zeus, meaning bright sky or daylight, associating him with the sun and the concept of an all-seeing eye. Now, Nikidor, as the one responsible for shutting the eyes of Aquila and plunging Amphorius into darkness, is, of course, connected to dusk and the recurring eclipse imagery. This is probably why Castrum Kremnos is covered in stars of Orynyx too. Nikidor's main aesthetic inspiration is based on the Greek god Ares, the god of war, who is associated with the planet Mars. This is also why Mydei is named Mydemos. Deimos, one of Ares and Aphrodite's sons, embodies the feeling of dread before a battle. This is the very emotion that Phaethon struggled with as they neared Nikidor, but Mydei remained unaffected by it. For Nikidor's purpose, we need to look back to Sumer for their Mars deity Nergal, who is probably a closer equivalent to the Greek god Hades as king of the underworld, but in this instance, Nergal fulfills the role of a war deity associated with the sunset, whose rituals are supposed to force ghosts to go to the underworld at night. This is why Nikidor appears to have the role of feeding the dead souls to his apparent ally Thanatos. As a war deity, Nergal is also associated with the mighty lion. Back in Greece, Ares has an interesting role in relation to Aphrodite, his lover and the mother of Deimos. See, Aphrodite is actually an imported version of Ishtar, specifically from the Phoenician version called Ashtart. Similarly, Ishtar's husband Dumuzi exists in the form of the Phoenician Adon, adopted into Greece as Adonis, Aphrodite's mortal lover, who Ares kills out of jealousy. Ishtar's warlike aspects were downplayed in Greek culture, but traces of her martial nature can still be found, especially in Sparta, where she was sometimes depicted armed and in the armor of Ares. Fun fact, it seems the backstory about Aphrodite being born from the severed genitals during the Cronus-Uranus battle seems to be copied from the Hittite story of Kumarbis tearing off the genitals of Anu and creating 3 gods. I really want to explain the golden scapegoat, but before I do that, I have to go back and explain one more Sumerian story about Ishtar and Dumuzi called Inanna's Descent. As I previously explained, the Sumerians based their gods around natural phenomena, and one of the most impactful events is the cycle of seasons. As spring dies out into winter and is reborn next year, this greatly influences the daily life of the Sumerians who rely on agriculture for their food. Naturally, they had a divine explanation for this. The gods related to harvests were dying and being resurrected every year. Pretty simple conclusion to make, honestly. There were a few gods who followed this idea, but the story of Dumuzi is probably the most important one, as this is the story that not only becomes Aphrodite, Adonis, and Persephone, but also, unironically, Jesus. As the story goes, Ishtar was always up to some nonsense, but this time she had decided she wanted to steal the power of the queen of the underworld called Ereshkigal. She put on 7 heavenly garments to imbue herself with magical power and went to the doors of the underworld and requested an audience with Ereshkigal. Knowing Ishtar always had something devious planned, she told her guard to make her walk through 7 doors, and at each door she had to remove 1 garment until she was presented before the Queen of Death without any of her powers. Having fallen for the trick, Ishtar ends up dead and her corpse is kept in hell. But Ishtar had a backup plan. If she didn't return, her servant was supposed to beg the other gods to rescue her. They complied, sending in blessed flies to find her body and bring her back to life, but Ereshkigal was not pleased. Ishtar had intended to commit terrible crimes against her and she needed someone to pay the price. Ishtar promised to find her someone and left. As she looked around at her family and subjects, she dismissed everyone as a candidate, except her husband, Dumuzi. Against his will, the Shepherd King was forced to replace Ishtar in the realm of the dead and pay for her crimes against the goddess. After some time, Ishtar had a change of heart, and they arranged for Dumuzi to be exchanged with his sister for half a year. So now you have the scapegoat Shepherd King, who is forced to die and be reborn to pay for the crimes of the fruit-eating goddess, the morning and evening star Venus. If you don't know, Venus appears in the east or the west in the morning or evening, depending on the time of year, so this is where they came to associate the change of seasons with Ishtar's changing mind. What the people learned of this story, or perhaps what the story justified, was the idea that crimes against the gods could be repaid with the sacrifice of a sheep or goat or other cattle, which also overlapped with the Sumerian idea that they had to provide resources for the lazy gods. When you wanted to appeal to a god for any reason, you could sacrifice livestock and ideally they would be satisfied enough to grant your wishes. By the time this story gets to Greece, the motivation has been changed from a grave crime to a love triangle between Aphrodite and the goddess of the underworld Persephone as they fight over Adonis. The motive of the dying and resurrecting god remains in Adonis and also in Persephone, who herself is a spring goddess. In the Bible, this idea becomes the scapegoat upon whom you can transfer your sins and send away from the village, just as Ishtar transferred her sins to Dumuzi. This is probably the best time for me to bring up the pomegranate situation. See, pomegranates are not native to the Greece region, instead coming from Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley region. It was a very popular fruit that was cultivated and exported frequently. In Greek myth, Persephone was bound to return to the underworld each year after eating its seeds, while Adonis, slain by the jealous Ares, bled into the earth, giving rise to anemones and sometimes pomegranates. Its deep red colour connected it to blood and made it a natural symbol of death and sacrifice. In Amphorius, the story goes that the followers of Nicator used to drink the literal blood of their slain opponents, but Phagusa, who had humiliated Nicator in order to save her people from Nicator's wrath, swapped out the blood with pomegranate honey brew, also known as mead, a fermented beverage similar to beer. Phagusa is the alcoholic titan implied to be the slurred voice hungering for ambrosia at the tidal bounty table. If we take this a step further, this is an alcoholic brew from the god of water and wine, offered in place of drinking blood to save the common people. Yes, I'm comparing this to the Eucharist, where at the Last Supper before its execution, to quote Corinthians, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me." Today, it's still a common practice to consume bread and wine at Eucharist that has been sanctified by a priest and converted into the body and blood of Christ. Drinking it is supposed to give Christians immortality at the end of the world. Okay, at this point, you might be wondering, what does all of this about Adonis and Jesus have to do with Mydei? Isn't that kind of random? Well, no, because Adonis and Jesus are both actually Nanook. Alright, this needs some explaining. A look at Nanook. They have a gash across their chest, arms outstretched, and wounds on their hands and feet, the same locations as the 5 wounds of Jesus, where he was nailed to the cross and pierced by a spear, dying to atone for Eve's original sin in the Garden of Eden. Jesus is also called the Shepherd King of the Jews and the Lamb of God, which brings us right back to the theme of sacrificial shepherd kings. And just to bring it full circle, crucifixion has obviously played a large role in Greco-Roman history, both used against them and then later against their eastern enemies from whom they had learned the practice. Apparently, Alexander the Great, one of Mydei's major inspirations, crucified 2,000 Phoenicians on his conquest. Brutal. Now, take a look at the golden scapegoat puzzle. The entire bottom row is covered in thorns, and falling into them earns you the achievement Inverted Crown of Thorns with a description: some wear a crown of thorns, some others, however. Most of you probably recognize the reference. When Jesus was crucified, the Romans mockingly gave him a crown of thorns, which has since become a symbol of his suffering. That's why Sunday is covered in thorns too. His entire theme revolves around the 8th day, a reference to the Christian variation of Sabbath, the day of rest established by none other than the Sumerians. They were the first to take a rest day every 7 days, dedicated to prayer at night, a practice that later shaped Abrahamic traditions. In Greek mythology, there is a golden ram called the Chrysomolus, which came to represent the Aries constellation, the ram constellation associated with Dumuzi by the Babylonian astrologists, and ruled by the planet Mars. In the later Greek and Roman myth, the golden ram was sent by Hermes to rescue 2 people who were supposed to be sacrificed to Zeus, or sometimes Ares. After carrying them away, the ram tells them to sacrifice it to the gods instead and then hang its golden fleece from a tree within a grove dedicated to Ares, the god of war. This fleece was then guarded by a sleepless serpent dragon. I have some suspicions that our golden ram has already been strung up on the Amphorius tree, and the infinity sign everywhere represents the serpentine powers that guard it, potentially related to the Leviathan, especially if there are dragons here and we are feeding the core flames to Phagusa, who is themed after the Ouroboros. There's been a few too many out of left field references to the permanents, Leviathans, and literal dragons for this to be a coincidence, if you ask me. Now, do you remember the Duke Inferno Ifrit and all that built up hype around him before Penacony, only to have him die to Acheron, which, by the way, I refuse to believe a black hole can kill a dimension teleporting incorporeal flame, but I digress. And then there was this ominous dialogue with Candace during Penacony that was just never resolved. I also find it funny that it was Dr. Ratio and Acheron, both with Greek themes, who are the ones involved with this Ifrit subplot, and that it was Acheron's ally Black Swan who sends us here. Yeah, I bet after all that discussion of goat sacrifices and golden scapegoats, you're probably looking at Ifrit's face pretty suspicious right now. But honestly, I think the beginning of their trailer is more suspicious, considering there's a literal golden-blooded scapegoat being sacrificed on our screens. The craziest thing, and truly this has driven me insane since I discovered this last year, but that planet they came from named Fatora. Yeah, that's a random English translation error, and it's actually supposed to be called Tophet, meaning fireplace, as in The Canaanite Phoenician burial grounds, where there's thousands of infants and goats' remains, are burned and cremated and then stored within jars within amphora. And it's not like the golden scapegoat mutterings mentioned the scapegoat sinner being turned to ashes, put in jars, then buried in the four corners of the world, imprisoned in a lightless dungeon in the sky as the living dead, his sins being light itself, which is also destruction or anything. And what was that thing Xiaoji said about Amphoris being Pandora's box, the object that is the Greek equivalent of Eve's original sin, bringing all evil into reality, but also hope? But back to real world Toffets. The goats are definitely sacrifices, but there's some dispute about whether or not the Phoenicians really were sacrificing live babies in a ritualistic fire or not, but the Greeks and the Israelites definitely at least thought they were. Just keep in mind these foreign sources are likely propaganda, but this is the context for Ifrit's
Children of the Flame, this marks your rite of passage.
I imagine Nanook's rejection of Ifrit is because his offerings are meaningless. A golden scapegoat is supposed to be a price paid for the golden river, likely part of a bargain with the equilibrium who controls it. I should also mention, and this is a real kicker, but the Greeks thought that the Phoenicians were sacrificing these goats and babies to the god Cronus, as in the planet Saturn. I see what you're doing, hell yeah, I see it and I'm obsessed, keep doing it. But back to Mydei, obviously his gameplay path is destruction, and visually he is compared to Nanook, even crying from the same side of his face as Nanook is. Normally, I wouldn't consider the gameplay path to be related to lore, but in the simulated universe, Nanook's path to destruction has a theme surrounding the sacrifice of HP, just like Mydei's path in DU. Because in fact, this is a running theme, especially among destruction units. The important thing is that it's themed around the sacrifice of oneself or your team in order to do more damage, similar to how Abundance Path heals and Preservation creates shields. In fact, this extends to Mydei's own personality, where he has demonstrated repeatedly that he is okay with throwing himself in harm's way to die over and over and over and over again if it will accomplish their goals. Not that he is a suicidal person like Blade is, but rather he is willing to sacrifice himself for the sake of others. He took up the mantle of strife and immediately headed out to live in isolation in a place he wanted to avoid. A place that brought him so much sadness that Phaedon told us being there would make him cry, just because he thought it would be appropriate to sacrifice himself against the black tide, so everyone else could be safer. In fact, part of his trial was the acceptance of the prophecy that he would die with a wound in his back, but he not only casually shrugs this off, but also uses the prophecy as a weapon against himself in case he, like Nikador, fell to the madness and needs to be stopped one day. He has an immortality that he doesn't use to protect himself, but rather bring himself as much suffering as necessary to pay the price of the freedom of others, which he's been doing his entire life, from rescuing stranded fishermen in the River of Souls as a child to fighting for the safety of the detachment as they fled Castrum Kremnos. I should probably mention that I don't think the motif of the golden scapegoat applies solely to Mydei, but rather to the entirety of Amphorius, especially with the way that everybody is sacrificing themselves in some capacity for the prophecy, or even just in general. It feels like they're all on the chopping block, so to speak. They're all the sacrifices that will burn in the fires of the Tophet to be buried in the amphora urns. Xiaoji himself told us that Amphorius was inspired by Pandora's box. And following with the thought that fire is the embodiment of sin, there is the story of Prometheus who stole fire from the heavens and gave it to humans. To punish him, Zeus says, "Son of Lapetus, surpassing all in cunning, you are glad that you have outwitted me and stolen fire, a great plague to you yourself and to men that shall be. But I will give men as the price for fire an evil thing in which they may all be glad of heart while they embrace their own destruction." That evil thing came in the form of the first woman, Pandora, who was given a jar that she opened containing all the evil in the world. This is Pandora's box. It's implied that everyone will die, and only Phaenon, as the deliverer, will see the new world. There's also the past self in the minigame, where the entire gimmick is using their actions to accomplish your goals as the future self while also avoiding direct contact with them. This reminds me of Synthesters and the king from the war that started the swarm disaster, the guy with the white crown who broke his ankles and was left alone in the sand, unable to die, until he finally reunited with the shadow of Nihility, his own Synthester that was brought to him through a memory bubble, and then he vanished, to the dismay of the arbitrators of equilibrium. We don't know what happened to him after he disappeared, but the swarm disaster also gave us this picture, and for obvious reasons, I'm quite suspicious. I should also note that his disappearance coincides with the exact moment the swarm disaster was brought to an end. I think I wouldn't be surprised if it turned out Flame Reaver was actually Phaedon's future self who was trying to change the course of fate, much like the minigame, and breaking the rules by interacting with us. If Mem has more powerful time manipulation powers than Orynyx does, and if Mem is related to Cyrene in some way, I can see a potential time travel plot being set up here to oppose the Flame Chase journey and divert the prophecy, but that's entirely my speculation. As for Aquila representing destruction in the new DU, I believe this is most likely because of the path's other inspiration. The picture is a reference to the Tower Tarot card, which is based on the Tower of Babylon, the legendary tower believed to have been built by a united humanity who has aspired to reach the heavens, but for their arrogance, God struck down the tower and thus humanity was separated. Aquila fulfills a similar role as God in this story, striking down any who might dare to reach the heavens. Also, since I mentioned the golden scapegoat muttering suggested the sky was a lightless prison for the sacrificed sinners, it's possible that could be related to Aquila, but maybe their light is also a sin. Not to get too conspiratorial on everyone, but maybe Aquila is using the sacrificed lights and the scapegoats as fuel for their sons, and the remaining Ashen people are the Black Tide monsters, and that's why Nicator fought both the Black Tide and Aquila, and wanted to take out Kefali, who was holding Aquila's Dawn device. If light itself is the terrible sin that burns them all to ashes, things start to come together. Where there is fire, there is ash. I find these markings in Castrum Kremnos Soulforge also really weird, but I can't yet put my finger on exactly why. I mean, we have been told that the eclipse also brought the golden blood, and the eclipse of the sun should be a representation of Nicator's power as they targeted the sun, but eclipses also involve moons, and moons seem to be Thanatos dragon eggs. Thanatos, Orynyx, and Nicator probably all had the same goal of taking out Aquila, but why does this result in the flowing golden blood? And why do we deliver the core flames straight into the mouth of the hungry Fagusa, who is also supposed to be a parallel of Ouroboros, who brings the tides in the swarm disaster? As in, Ouroboros, who is a Leviathan. So many thoughts inside my head, but I'll probably think about that more after the next patch when I talk about alchemy, philosopher's stones, and dragon's blood mercury water. There's also Icarus, the guy who in Greek myths flew too close to the sun, and so his wax wings melted and he plunged into the earth. Castrum Kremnos was built with Icarus's help, and Acheron and Welt's discussion in Penacony also compares Kevin and the trailblazing spirit to Icarus, so this is a notable comparison, and I imagine that we are going to be using Mydei's new flying superpowers and his flying castle to penetrate the heavens, fulfilling Nicator's original aspiration. I also wouldn't be surprised if it overlaps with the Flood Myth story and we have to gather all the remaining Occamans onto Castrum Kremnos as if it was Noah's Ark, technically also returning his people to their homeland at the same time. Just as the Black Tide finally claims Occama and we are forced to finally all or nothing confront Aquila. As Anaxa said, we don't target Aquila because we can't fly, but now we can. Chapter 3, The Prophecies. Initially, I had planned to cover Mydei's full backstory along with the entire history of Castrum Kremnos and Nicator in this video, but honestly, that would take way too long, so instead I'll be focusing on key details I want to highlight. If there's enough interest, I might do a full retelling in a future video, but for now we're keeping it concise. That said, in piecing together the history of Castrum Kremnos, I think I figured out who really killed baby Mydeimus, and more importantly, why. So let's get into that. Okay, enough theatrics, I'm just going to spoil the answer now. It was Orynyx. Or maybe instead it was the priests of Orynyx. It's actually pretty obvious. I mean, a prophecy is literally the reason he was thrown into the sea, but what exactly were they trying to achieve with this self-fulfilling prophecy? What was their motive? To explain, let's go all the way back to the beginning and run this through step by step. Firstly, before the three Calamity Titans appeared, Aquila and Orynyx existed as the embodiments of day and night. Supposedly, Talantin was responsible for keeping the balance between them, with some probably fictional stories telling of how Orynyx would try to steal the light of Aquila so that night could be just as luminous. Orynyx is literally the Evernight, meaning the endless night, so we can see how Aquila bringing the twilight, the dusk, and the dawn really puts a wrench into Orynyx's philosophies. Now, one day, for some reason or another, the three Calamity Titans appear: Nicator, Zagreus, and Thanatos. For some reason, probably because of the tide, Nicator is really fixated on taking out Orynyx's #1 rival, the Sun Titan Aquila. What a delightful and awfully convenient thing for this Titan to be doing. Outside of shared goals, there is physical evidence that Nicator and Orynyx were allied. The stars that fly around Castrum Kremnos can be found within the Temple of the Three Fates. These stars resemble the super strong Orynyx, Blessing, and the correlation between night and stars is straightforward. What's particularly damning is that the temple also features depictions of the statues of Nicator, explicitly stated to be Nicator within Castrum Kremnos, which is why there are so many around the place. During these early years following the instructions of a prophecy, Castrum Kremnos is constructed from a volcano by Gorgo and given flight so that it can better follow around Nicator while Nicator flies around following Aquila. By the way, Gorgo is named after an iconic Spartan queen known for her many iconic quotes and being married to Leonidas, the guy who took an army of 300 Spartans against the Persians in the Greco-Persian Wars. There was a very dramatic movie about this based on an American comic that was based on the British epic that was loosely based on the actual history of Leonidas. Back to HSR Gorgo. Before the castle was built, Gorgo defeated the terrible Chryseis Leo, meaning Golden Lion, and kept its corpse. This act mirrors Heracles' first labor, where he slays the Nemean lion, whose invulnerable pelt he later wears as armor. Of course, the lion battling hero archetype goes even further back, right to Gilgamesh, who also single-handedly fought lions and wore their pelts on his adventure. And if we're talking nearly indestructible lion beasts, there's also the Anzu monster, famously battled by the Sumerian warrior god Ninurta, but we'll talk about Anzu's relevancy soon. So, Gorgo keeps the head of the Chryseis Leo and uses it as a megaphone to amplify its roar, catching Nicator's attention. Nicator, impressed, gives them the sword. With that, they build Castrum Kremnos, using a volcano and some fancy tech from Icarus to get it airborne. I'm guessing this is also when they enslaved Cartonos' people, but there's no direct confirmation. While Nicator is busy chasing Aquila, Castrum Kremnos also wages war against various city-states. This is where Fagusa's story comes in, how she humiliated Nicator and in response to his demand for her followers' blood, replaced the blood with the pomegranate meat that Nicator liked even more than the blood. Meanwhile, the society evolves into a gruesome system where kingship is claimed by challenging and defeating the current king in a periodic festival. All the dead, both allies and enemies, are then sacrificed to Nicator, who, on top of everything, seems to act as a psychopomp for Thanatos. About 1,000 years later, the flame chase begins, and eventually the core flame of Talantin is taken, so now nobody is keeping balance between Orynyx and Aquila. So skip ahead about 1,000 years again, which, by the way, I really wish we had exact dates, because piecing this together was an absolute nightmare. But eventually we get to the reign of Europon, who killed his own father in gladiatorial combat to claim the throne. Europon is named after the first king of the Europontid Spartan dynasty, who claimed descent from Heracles. Gorgo, on the other hand, wasn't born with that name. She renamed herself after defeating a lion in battle, just like the founder of Castrum Kremnos. She arrives at one of the gladiatorial festivals to challenge the king, but after 10 rounds of combat with no victor, Europon proposes to her instead. And wow, ever heard that before? A king meets his equal in battle, they fight for a symbolic 10 rounds to that victory, and then there's a mother's heirloom ring subplot, and finally Albert explicitly references "till death do us part."
Oh, you two truly are friends till death do you part.
All wrapped up in a very meta joke about them being best friends, but not actually friends.
You and Mydei must be true friends.
True friends? No way.
Insane work. Hell yeah, keep it up. One day censorship won't exist and you'll finally be free, I believe. Maybe you won't even have to tell us about your gay fairy ships and coded messages left in pieces of cheese anymore. Anyway, around this time, Nikidor begins succumbing to the black tide and splits off his reason into Nias, but Castrum Kremnos itself is also being corrupted, just not by the black tide. As you'd know from running around in Castrum Kremnos and interacting with the past memories, a prophecy is delivered to King Europon. At this point, he's happily married and eagerly awaiting the birth of his son. Their society does encourage that son to one day kill him for the throne, but he and Gorgo have already agreed that patricide won't be a thing for them. Europon, in his own words, sees their traditions as a joke. Glorify it all you want, but it will not alter the nature of slaughter. Those who revel in it are but murderers. Even if he had some lingering doubts, Gorgo insists that no one had more faith in Mydei than Europon himself. A few months later, a priest delivered a prophecy to Europon. His child, Mydei, would take his life, end Nikidor's existence, and bring down the Kremnos dynasty. Mydei would become the crown prince who vanquished a nation. For a proud king and a hopeful father, this prophecy was a nightmare. His guards sided with the priest, and in his rage, Europon realized Castrum Kremnos was crumbling. Nikidor was losing control, and he had no choice for the sake of his kingdom. To the people of Amphoros, except Anaxa, the prophecy was unquestionable. It was his kingdom or a single child. Europon prepared to face his wife in combat, the same way they had met and fallen in love. No one else would be allowed to kill his beloved wife, and after the battle he would rid himself of Mydei, the destroyer of Castrum Kremnos. But yes, we all know Europon killed Mydei because of the prophecy, but there's a critical detail everyone is overlooking. Even when Mydei had already escaped the river and returned to Castrum Kremnos only to flee with the Kremnoan detachment, Aquila was still shining bright. At this point, Nikidor is asleep, and Europon has been trying to split up his soul so that he can give him an immortal body. Not only did the prophecy serve to kill the Kremnoan queen and banish the prince, but it instilled a paranoia in Europon to immortalize the god that his son was prophesied to kill. After Mydei returns to Kremnos and kills his father, he leaves to return to Okama. The corrupted and now immortal Nikidor then awakens and starts killing everyone who remained in Castrum Kremnos, including the hero from the Relic set, and of course he targets his 2,500-year-old rival, Aquila, finally winning, and the sky goes dark. At last, the priests of Orynyx can witness that Evernight they were so eager for, and finally the warring city-state has been thoroughly destroyed. Oh, and did I mention that political prophecies were fabricated, sold for high prices, and used to fuel city-state conflicts? Some factions were profiting off this manipulation, and yet one of the Anasteeds sent to unite the city-states got lost in space-time and only arrived after Nikidor's attack on Kefali. Very suspicious considering Yanis' ties to Orynyx. Also, holy maidens were meant to be protected from Castrum Kremnos specifically, so they weren't exactly big fans of the place, and neither was Nikidor themselves. Orynyx wasn't exactly enthusiastic about helping us defeat Nikidor despite their active attack on Kefali, and they already made themselves pretty clear about opposing the Flame Chase journey even if they're not actively combative. Up until Mem arrived and took over. Curiously, this whole thing seems to have been part of the Flame Chase anyway, and Mydei becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, driven to destroy Nikidor, turned against his father, and shaped by suspicious dreams from his mother. Now he willingly joins the Flame Chase, wielding Castrum Kremnos as part of the prophecy. Right, how convenient for the prophecy. Was all of this ultimately for the best? Probably, but without the prophecy, Mydei's parents wouldn't have turned against each other and died, and Nikidor would have stayed mortal, with his core flame right for the taking, likely never getting the chance to take out Aquila's eyes and plunging the world into darkness. And it's not like the Kremnoans wouldn't have tried to kill Nikidor, considering we know that's exactly what they did after Europon died and Mydei was gone. But they all died because, obviously, Nikidor was unkillable. Without that prophecy, the Kremnoans could have stayed safely in their castle and not been forced to take refuge in Okama. The real beneficiaries of this scheme are the factions who both hate Castrum Kremnos and are eager for the Evernight, all of which can be traced back to the corrupted temple officials. So, call me an Axa, but I'm suspicious. Yes, I do think Aquila is likely working directly with, or at least causing, the Black Tide and should probably be dealt with, but there's also this lingering wonder I have that perhaps the Black Tide was present around Aquila because they were chasing the light. Perhaps the Evernight is actually allied with the Black Tide. If you read the Golden Scapegoat mutterings, you learn that light is a sin and that the sinners are turned to ash, and that at the end of it all, the sinners are merely killing versions of themselves over and over again. Versions of themselves that haven't died before, mind you. Perhaps the Black Tide and the Ebonite both see the light as evil. A cool detail I noticed during Mydei's trailer is that he ends up fighting the Griffin, a creature both eagle and lion, which symbolically represents not only Gorgo's fight against the Chryseis Leo, but also Nikedor's fight against Aquila. The Griffin itself is described in-game as a construct created by Aquila that also represents Aquila, so Mydei fighting the specific creature to gain Nikedor's blessing is really quite poetic, indicating his capability to inherit both Gorgo's and Nikedor's legacies. Griffins are a creature that most people think originated in Greece, but actually showed up in Sumer thousands of years before Greece, likely making their way into Greek culture through the migrating Mesopotamian tribe that came to inhabit Crete, known as the Minoans, who also depict griffins in their art. Now, if you pay really close attention to the griffin Mydei is fighting, you'll notice that it has the head of a lion. This is a critical detail because Greek griffins always have the eagle beaks. The griffin with the lion head is actually a Mesopotamian only version of a griffin, especially used in the depictions of the Anzu. I also get a good chuckle from the drawing of the lightning bolt used by Ninurta to hunt the Anzu compared to the lightning bolt used by Zeus. Both Ninurta and Zeus have the eagle as their associated animal too. I also want to talk about Mydei's curse of immortality, his defect as a Chrysos heir. I think a lot of people were quick to notice the similarity between Mydei and the later Roman version of the Achilles myth, where his mother dips him by the ankle into the river to make him immortal. But he has that one weak point, the Achilles heel, where her fingers were pinched. Believe it or not, this actually doesn't seem to be the source directly referenced for Mydemos. It's actually referencing Siegfried from Germanic folklore, such as the Nibelungenlied and especially the Thirdrich Saga. Now, the Siegfried myth is probably inspired by the Achilles story, but this variation is specifically a weakness in his back, where a leaf fell when he was bathing in the blood of a dragon. I probably don't have to explain how the river in Amphoros is similar to the dragon water in the Scale Gorge, do I? His best friend is also the one who kills him with a spear in the back because of the mess he caused with their wives, paralleling the setup for Phaenon to be the one to eventually kill Mydei. One of the wives in question is Brunhilde, the original sleeping princess and the first Valkyrie, a clear inspiration of Kiana and the sleeping finality, something she shares with Kevin. Kiana's father is also named after Sigrid for this reason, as well as the Nibelungenlied being a big thing for Genshin, with the sleeping heavenly principles and Nibelung the dragon. Creative naming scheme, I know. Really, Hoyoverse loves to keep reusing the same sources of inspiration, especially when Kazlana XPs like Phaenon are involved. One more thing to bring up is Mydei's connection to Alexander the Great. Of course, many have already noticed that his 5 friends and Kreteros are all named after generals of Alexander the Great. There's a little bit of overlap between their life stories and the in-game personalities, but it's pretty weak connections, except for Hephaestion. Hephaestion really did die of illness. He was also Alexander's other half, for lack of a better word, acting as pretty much a second incarnation of Alexander himself. And yes, many think they were probably lovers, though there's no solid proof. Alexander was tutored by Aristotle, who instilled in him a love for the Iliad, leading to Alexander basically role-playing his life as Achilles with Hephaestion as his Patroclus, and unfortunately for Alexander, that got a bit too real when Hephaestion suddenly died and Alexander spiraled into a deep depression, also dying not long after. Before all of that, Aristotle really didn't like the people from the East, so he raised Alexander to become a hero of legend who would conquer the East and unite the entire world. And that's more or less exactly what he did, going on a warpath all the way through Persia to India, but his soldiers more or less refused to keep going. Alexander really wanted to make the legendary Babylon the capital of his united world. When Alexander died in Babylon, it began the Hellenistic period of Greece, where they ruled pretty much the entire region, including Egypt, up until the death of Cleopatra. And guess what general of Alexander's is the one to take control of the Mesopotamia region following his death? Seleucus I, Nicator. There is so much more that I could say going into all the little details I noticed along the way. Seriously, the notes I took are actually much longer than this video script is, but I think this is enough for one video. Were you already familiar with things I discussed in this video? What do you think is going on with the Golden Scapegoat? Do you ship Mydei and Phanon as much as Albert and Phanon do? Are you as nervous as I am about the fact that Mydei is listed as Phanon's most desired desert island adventure companion, while also probably being fated to wandering a desert all alone? Yeah, can't wait for that pain, thank you in advance, hell yeah. If you've learned something or even just enjoyed the video, consider leaving a like and subscribing if you haven't. I also do really appreciate all the donations to my Ko-Fi. If you happen to be keen on doing some independent research on the topics mentioned in this video, I've provided a bunch of really great resources that I'd recommend having a look through. Mostly, I recommend reading the book I linked translating the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's a great place to start, and the translator provides the missing context for you along the way. It's much better than reading it straight from a website or something. Afterwards, consider watching Fate Babylonia and getting into Fate in general, especially since there's a collab coming soon. That's what I've been doing at least. Next time, I plan to focus on Anaxa and Castorus's alchemy references, since those seem extra relevant in the next patch, and I'll take any chance I can get to read through medieval alchemy literature so you don't have to. I'll see you guys then. Bye.